Okay, so today's is a consideration of Scarlett Thomas's book, Our Tragic Universe. Scarlett Thomas is a tricky writer. I love her, but I appreciate she's not everyone's cup of tea. She first came to my awareness with a book called The End of Mr. Y, which wasn't her first book, but it was the one that sort of broke her into people's perceptions. And it's a book that's informed by sort of homeopathy, I think. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it because I'm talking about this one rather than that. But it's the homeopathy is, as far as I understand it, because I haven't sort of exposed myself to it, but it's the treatment of the whole human being, and it seems to me to resonate with psychoanalysis in that there's a book called I can't remember what it's called now, but basically you go through this book, lots of questions: are you this or that, and which they're questions about you, which are to me not dissimilar to psychoanalysis or even tarot card reading in a way. Obviously, they have slightly different frames of reference, and once you work your way through these questions, you get to a point of this is your problem. Here's a little vial of some sort of water or some sort of placebo, and take that, and you would have solved the problem that you came here to solve. But of course, the point is the process of self insight by answering the questions. That is the treatment and the cure, not the little vial of liquid or whatever. And the end of Mr. Y exists as if inside that book, and it is very interesting. It's flawed, but it's interesting. But she was a writer that thereafter sort of intrigued me. And I think her work comes to a head, an apotheosis, in this book called Our Tragic Universe. And it's it's a book about story. Now, as a writer, I have a very, very set view about story, and basically I'm hostile to story. And I think Thomas is too. And it's quite unusual for writers to be hostile to stories because most of them write them. What I write involves story, but it's not the highest priority for me. It's not about the story. It's more about maybe the storyteller or why we need to tell stories. And that's also what this book is about, in that it seeks to tell the storyless story. That is a what happens to the characters in this book, if anything happens to them at all, because most of it is one character going to sit in the house of a nun and they have a cup of tea and they talk and stuff. And if anything actually happens, if there's an act or an event, it normally happens off stage, as it were. She doesn't write about it. But obviously, the consequences inform later in action rather than action. And Thomas also introduces a lot of non-Western traditions of narrative that are not telling stories, but fulfilling the function of what stories do. And that's what she's looking at. What do stories do for us? Can a story save your life? Some people would argue yes. People who write self-help books would argue yes. I was in this terrible position and then I did this and I managed to raise myself out of it, and this is my story and it can help you or whatever. I would say no. That's, delusionary or whatever, because you took that action to get out of the nadir and it worked for you, but it's not working as a story. It only becomes a story when you look back and sort of say, I was in this place, I did this, and I ended up here. It only becomes a story when you write about that sequence and you make it into a narrative. And I think Thomas feels the same as that. One quote from the book is, we should have stories not to tell us how to live and turn our lives into copies of stories, but to prevent us from having to fictionalise ourselves. And to me, that's the heart of this book. And it's a really interesting, it gets you thinking about, why story? Story is obviously hugely important to human beings because, we can't get enough of them. TV, film, charity gives. When someone makes an ask for a charity, they usually wrap it around an individual person's story and why you need to give to help similar people. Stories are incredibly important in our society. But I think, and I think Thomas thinks, although maybe I'm speaking out of turn on her behalf, no, actually, these are the wrong sort of stories, and they're used in the wrong way. They're used in a manipulative way, and they get in the way of us living our lives. what do stories and narratives do? Well, they pattern and they make orderly events that are not necessarily, we live our life minute to minute, day to day. And if we make a narrative of it to give it some sort of sense of order and meaning and flow, it doesn't make it any more real, because that's not how we live it. That's how we make sense of it to ourselves, and if we share it, it may make sense to others. But it's not how we live our lives. So are you always looking back to storyfy your life in order to give it meaning? But that what you're looking back on has already been lived. And these are the sorts of layers of resonance that Thomas is dealing with. And I think it's a really interesting, important book accordingly. It's flawed. It is also not going to be to everyone's taste, because people will read this and go, yeah, but where's the story? And I understand that, and I wouldn't recommend this book for people who are not going to get beyond that. But if you want to look behind the function of story, this is a really good starting point. And so I recommend it with reservations, I guess. I'm a huge Scarlett Thomas fan, and the book after this, which I read, which I now can't remember, seemed to me to pull back from the sort of the profundity, and was more of a sort of fairly standard novel. Yes, it sort of also itself pulled back from sort of serious story and action. It was more just people. I guess what she's doing is people, how do we spend our lives outside of work? We go and visit people, we have dinner parties, or we go to the pub and all that sort of thing, and she's sort of reproducing that. Now, in a way, that can be dull. It can be dull in our own lives, let alone in fiction. But I think if you can ascribe to it the sort of resonance of, well, this is what we do, let's try and make sense of this. It's not that significant, actually. It's not worth ordering. When someone tells you an anecdote about, some drunken escapade, it's, unless you were there, telling it down the line to as a story, who cares? So flawed, but I think worthwhile. But only if you've got a taste for that sort of inquiry, because there is no story to keep you hooked. Okay, so till next time.